thank you for joining us at SCUSA Can for our conversation on what will universities look like in 5 years. This theme grew out of predictions during the pandemic that 20% of universities will no longer exist in 5 years. At SCUSA Can, we're honored to welcome a distinguished panel of higher ed leaders with diverse perspectives from universities that are state, city, private, and primarily virtual institutions. Our moderator is the very respected Professor Illah Nourbakhsh, the K&L Gates Professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you, Illah, and thank you to our inspiring university leaders who will shed light on today's challenging theme.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be part of this. It's a complete pleasure to be here, and it's going to be my pleasure to welcome our honored panelists. I'm going to frame the problem a little bit first, and then welcome everybody here. And in my framing, the question is, what will universities look like in 5 years? But the one label that is the thing we talk about most among my circles is change. Everything is changing, and it's changing more rapidly than ever. We all know about the turnover issues we have in higher ed, all the way back to pre-kindergarten, in terms of people who are rapidly changing positions and rapidly changing curriculum. But policy is changing all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it has direct ramifications for us. At the same time, we have ever-increasing economic disparities that makes the question valid: who benefits from improvements in education and educational pedagogy? And then, of course, there's tech. And what would a conference be if we don't mention the phrase GPT chat? Technology is changing how we teach. It's changing how students learn. One simple, fast story for you. One of my best computer programmers just told me yesterday that for the last week, he's been writing with Copilot on. Copilot is GPT chat, writing code with him. And he said for the last week, he's been writing the comments at the beginning of the code, and it writes all the code. No kidding. Hasn't made any mistakes. And he doesn't think in another week he'll be able to write code without it. That's seriousness of change in how coding happens, something that was the bulwark of STEM education, the job you'll never lose. And when that is that thoroughly changed by technology, we know we're in for quite a wild ride. So with all those things that press on the uncertainty we have around the future of higher education and universities, I'm pleased to bring to the table 4 people who are the best people I can imagine to have in the room to have a chat with us about this. To introduce them first, we have Nancy Cantor, who's Chancellor of Rutgers, Newark. It's a pleasure to have you here, Nancy. We have Paul LeBlanc, President of Southern New Hampshire University. It's a pleasure to have you, Paul. We have Dr. Marsha Lovett, who's Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University. Not my alma mater, but my alma. It's where I am right now. And we have Chancellor Juan Salgado of City Colleges of Chicago. So welcome, Juan. Now, this is the moment at which in a live session, I'd ask you all to applaud the outstanding group that we brought together, but you can't. So I'm going to ask you to just silently applaud, and I'm going to jump right into some questions. We have a prepared question for each of our guests to get started, but I want you, the audience, to think about the questions you want to ask, and please chat them. We're going to pull out those questions and call them out and use them to create a wonderful discussion and conversation between our honored guests. I'm going to start with you, Chancellor Cantor, and talk about issues of equity. Universities are a form of anchor institution, just like museums, but we're all talking about community equity with renewed vigor now. My question for you is, how do you see universities taking on an institutional responsibility for engaging in community work and innovating in the communities in which they function?
So thank you, Illah. I think that's for us, at least in Newark, that is the heart of the question: is how do we think about our social responsibility, our responsibility to be anchor institutions, not just to be haphazardly in a community, but really to be of community. And of course, community can be defined geographically in many ways. In our case, it's a large city. What does it mean to be an urban institution? But anchor institutions are all over the country and the world. So when I think about that, I start with the notion that in 5 years, I hope all universities and colleges begin to think of themselves as anchor institutions and take an outside-in perspective, is what I call it. Universities are used to being in monasteries, used to being with gates, used to being taking an inside out look. That is, we're used to looking at ourselves and deciding how we want to compete in the world, as compared to being a public good, thinking about how do we really become trusted neighbors, trusted institutions. And that couldn't be more important these days for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that many of the polls being taken suggest that higher ed has a trust problem, that in fact, the public really wants to understand what higher ed is doing for it, with it, in it, if you will. And so I break that down by thinking first about what I call the perfect storm. We have a perfect storm. The fastest growing populations are increasingly being left on the sidelines of opportunity. We have a huge wealth gap that's increasing. We know that there's systemic racism that has led to disparate impacts on BIPOC communities. This is the talent pool of the future. So if universities don't transform, and it may take more than 5 years, but if we don't transform from our competitive stance, from our isolated stance, from our selectivity obsession, if you will, we will not be serving the public. We will not be doing what an anchor institution needs to do. So what do we need to do? We first of all need to really have a laser focus on social mobility, on creating social mobility. And social mobility, in my terms, is a very large term. It certainly includes economic mobility, but it also includes empowering next generation of change makers to be as diverse in all of our sectors as our population is. And that's really a responsibility for all of us to think broadly and expansively. That's going to mean that we have to collaborate. We have to really get away from we're the institution that's the best. We have to be collaborators. And who do we collaborate with? First of all, we clearly need a pre-K, if you will, to community college, to four-year institution, to graduate institutions pathway system. So we need that kind of ecosystem. But I would argue that true anchor institutions also collaborate, if you will, horizontally. That is, we collaborate across sectors within our communities. If we're going to really be trusted neighbors, if you will, going to be trusted institutions in the public, we have to collaborate with the mayor's office. We have to collaborate with corporations. We have to collaborate with other educational institutions, with hospitals, with cultural institutions, to really think about the pressing challenges. And there's a virtuous cycle here, because the more high impact scholarship we do, the more we collaborate with communities, the more communities will trust and feel that we are accessible to send their sons and daughters. Now, that's going to require revamping financial aid. It's going to require the pathways that we talked about. It's going to require being in K-12 schools and really having things like dual enrollment for high school students in college courses so that they really feel a part of our communities. It's going to require expanding who we're really partnering with and reaching out to. We run, for example, a large prison education program all across the prisons in New Jersey and a large reentry program. There are many populations that are full of talent that we all don't cultivate and that we need to cultivate. I know Paul will talk about some of that in his work, and Juan as well. So the point here is that anchor institutions have to transform as universities. And that's why it goes back to the notion of what are we going to look like in 5 years? What we're going to look like in 5 years is that we're going to have a lot more partnerships. Those are going to be outward in partnerships. We're going to have to transform who's sitting at our table, not only our students, but our faculty and staff. We're going to have to think about hiring locally so that we empower the local community that we have. We're going to have to think about things like the digital divide and what does that really mean? What is broadband access? You talked about technology transforming. Well, I can tell you that we are certainly working in Newark with the mayor and others on a huge broadband project because equity comes down to that. We're going to have to think about curricula that plays to the lived experiences of a variety of populations. What's the lived experience of our undocumented students? They have to be a part of the curriculum that we have. We have to think about interdisciplinary programs that really, we like to think about, oh, there are high economic rewards to tech fields. Well, how are we going to get a broader population in tech fields? One way we're going to do it is we're going to think about everyday data. We're going to think about algorithmic bias. We're going to think about the things that their lived experience can bring to the table, and therefore that they can be a part of really being the change makers there. And then we're going to have to think about how we reward faculty and who our faculty are. So, for example, the kind of high impact scholarship that anchor institutions need to do in collaboration with community requires a whole different way of rewarding scholarship. It's a collaborative project. It's a co-creation. If you're working on community policing, as we are, for example, you cannot tell the community how to police. You have to learn to feed your data to community, and community feed solutions back. And the academy is not yet, I think, wired in that way, if you will. And then we're going to have to think about building what I call third spaces of collaboration. And those are not just the pathway programs, though those are critically important, but they're also spaces of co-creation that are not, nobody owns them. They're in community, they're of community. They may be virtual, but they may be physical as well. And in that space, you create the pressing knowledge that we all need to create equitable growth. So I think I'll stop there. I could go on forever on this topic.
Well, you're eloquent and you're also specific in great detail, which I love. And much of what you're saying feels to me like really renegotiating the power relationship between communities and anchor institutions, which is
I think
fabulous.
that is absolutely the key. And that's what I mean by the outward in.
Thank you. President LeBlanc, I'd like to go to you next. In your case, I'm really curious about the question of the challenges that online and physical universities face. They're different, they fulfill different needs, and yet in that landscape of online and in-person higher education, how do you think that's going to evolve in the next few years so that each type can provide the experiences it's ideally suited for?
Great question. I kind of just want to give Nancy my minutes so I can keep listening because you're so good, Nancy. I don't want to follow you. This is a really bad ordering of things. I think there are a number of binaries that are falling away, and I think one of them is this question of online versus in place. I just think we're going to see what is already emerging, which is a kind of fluidity insisted upon by the students and learners we serve. And it helps move us to a much more genuinely student-centric model of delivery that says, we need to understand, I'm going to channel my old friend Clay Christensen here, and understand the job you need us to do for you. And then I'm going to give you the flexibility and the fluidity and the options that allow you to get your education in the way that best fits your life and your demands. And when you think that way, then you start worrying less about where do institutions want to plant their flag. You plant your flag at the heart of student need. And that could be a hybrid program that says, we know you're a working adult and you have a busy schedule, and we understand that when we tether students to a place and a time, it's an inherently inequitable act, right? Time is a privilege. And if you work in large swaths of the American economy, you may not even know what your schedule is next week. So you want me to be in class at 3 o'clock? I don't know. So for me, online works better. However, for a young person who needs either structure or mentoring or what I might broadly call a coming of age experience, traditional residential campuses where they are face to face with somebody in relationship, and relationships are so critical. Maybe that's the better model for them. But what we need to be able to do is give them an ecosystem that allows them to move in and out of whatever modality makes the most sense for them. You might say in a given program, I'd like to push it to on any given day. Today, my daughter is sick. I'm a single parent. I'm staying home, but I'm accessing my learning in this way. Tomorrow, I definitely need to go in because I need to see Professor so-and-so because I'm really struggling with X, and they're so good. And I just love being with them because they also care about me, right? So you've got this mix. So I think that's a critical one. If I could just stay with the notion of binaries, and just sort of divert a little bit from this question of online versus in place. What we're seeing in our own enrollments, and this has been a relatively new development, is we've always described an online, we have about 185,000 active students right now. 35,000 of them are traditional age students and that was never the case. Our student was a 30-year-old with 2 kids and a dead-end job. Like, I need a credential to change my life. But increasingly now we're seeing a group of generation of learners who don't make those distinctions anymore. They don't think about, like, you and I still talk about, I'm going to go online and look for an X. I'm going to go online and order a Y. What 17-year-old is ever offline, right? This is like glued to their hands. And so they're much more comfortable with the notion, I'm going to get my education this way, I'm going to get my social mentoring in this way. And they are operating in these ways that we'll have to be really responsive to. But I want to go back to this notion of sort of binaries falling away, if I could just expand for a moment more. I think in this sort of emerging landscape then, especially one in which I think we're going to see massive job displacement with AI, like November 1st, 22 feels to me like the day that electricity was revealed to the world, like the world changed. And I would argue that we are now faced with really fundamental questions about what counts for knowledge. Questions of heuristics. What are we teaching? I might, if I were being really bombastic, I'd say on November 1st of this past year, all of our curricula became outdated overnight. Like, you have to be rethinking, what you're teaching and what the place of knowledge is. Nancy gave us a great example. You did, Illah, when you were talking about someone who's not using programming. I was talking to some of our marketing team today. They're now using AI to not only write scripts, but also to do shot selections. And they're like, is it great? No, but we're good enough to be able to see where it's not great, save a ton of time, and focus our stuff on our time on more productive things. I talked to one of our instructional designers who used it for a phlebotomy module and ran it by the nursing faculty, didn't say where it came from, just said, hey, does this look okay? And they're like, yeah, it's pretty good. Like, might do this, this, and this. Right? So content provision, publishers, tutoring support. I mean, it's all up for grabs, and we're going to have to think about that. So we have this really interesting question. Our world is changing. And I think in that ecosystem, we can include the following things. It's not going to be about degrees versus micro-credentials. It's going to be about both. Like, we don't want a two-tier system where poor kids get micros and rich kids get degrees. We're going to put them on stackable pathways. And look at, for some students, we have a coding academy called boot camp called Kinsey Academy. They can take somebody in 9 months and take them from $18,000 a year to $65,000 a year. That's life-changing. That student may drop out of the ecosystem for a year, get really good at their job till their supervisor taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, Nancy, we'd love to make you a team lead and move you over to quality assurance. You got some other competencies you have to master now. I dip back into the ecosystem. I do another 3-4 months. Now I'm ready. And by the way, my employer is paying. So I think in this sort of our thesis about the future, we're going to see a broader range of credentials available. We're going to see a broad array of providers producing knowledge or providing instruction. The universities are not going away. They're going to be critically important. They just won't hold quite the same monopoly over the marketplace that they do today. Degrees, critically important, not going away. There's going to be a lot of other options for students to get to that final destination. And I also think we're going to see a broader array of how we pay. So already our fastest growing sector is B2B. We're the largest educational partner for Amazon and Walmart, and they're educating a lot of their frontline people. They're writing the tuition check. When we partner with Guild and we go to Walmart, 97% of Guild students have no loans, no student debt when they graduate, at a time when students in America carry $1.7 trillion of debt, second only to home mortgages as a pool of debt. So who pays, who provides, all the modalities? I mean, it's a really exciting time. I wish I was 25 and starting my career, because I think this next phase is just incredibly thrilling. And among those old boundaries that fall away will be the one between K-12 and university. We ought to be comfortable with the idea of a 10th grade student getting her her associate's degree, or taking college math classes. We've got, with some of the partners on the phone right now, we've seen students walk across the stage and with the same handshake get their high school degree and their associate's degree. That's a really powerful model. And then I would just second everything Nancy said in terms of, we have to think about culturally informed curriculum. We have to think about questions of equity that plague us. But now I'm just listing things, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you. But it's a good list, and you could keep going. And what I love about this is this fundamental idea of losing binaries and losing boundaries, because everything you're describing is fluid in a way across age, across degree type, across type of modality of education. Yep. And I think that's really powerful. So now we've heard about the question of equity and the place of an anchor institution, but we've also heard about the identity of a university and how that can change and become more fluid. Next, I want to take a microscope and look inside the university. And so I'd like to turn to Dr. Lovett and think about pedagogy a little bit. In particular, in our new world, GPT-4, GPT chat, student interests are often at the intersection of many disciplines. It's almost impossible to stay inside one discipline anymore. But university departments are these old stoic things that have frictional boundaries. So the question is, how do you envision the successful approaches where universities embrace changing the way teaching and research happens to really bridge disciplinary boundaries?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Illah. And I think what really drives us at Carnegie Mellon, and I think is a great guiding principle to think about changing the curriculum and this idea of interdisciplinarity, is to see the teaching and research mission as driven by solving real world problems. So if the goal is to solve real world problems, not cookbook, textbook problems, then you're in another layer where interdisciplinarity is the natural place to go. It's where you need to go. And you might be familiar with, in the design field, the concept of wicked problems, problems that require thinking about the complexities and challenges of social policy and planning issues, where there's no straightforward articulation and there's no simple or final solution. These are the problems we need to deal with today. These are the problems we need to prepare our students to solve, and that our researchers and scholars need to be pursuing and pushing as well. And so I think one thing that's really great about this move is that it means relevance to students is baked in, because the students want to be able to apply what they're learning, and learning things that are applicable and relevant to problems they're facing, real world situations. And, our younger generations are very focused on issues and uncertainties in our world, climate change, inequities. And these are things that really need that interdisciplinary approach. The other thing that these interdisciplinary problems and educational opportunities pull in, and I would argue require, is considering the human part of the equation. So we're not just talking about technical knowledge and skill. We're talking about a humanistic approach. So I happen to know, Illah, that you led a course with a former colleague that was part of an interdisciplinary program we have at Carnegie Mellon on the focus of AI and ethics. So taking a very highly technical, we're talking about ChatGPT and the huge implications and consequences of technology and AI, doing that in a technological vacuum is not sufficient. It's missing the point, right? Combining those kinds of issues with ethical issues, societal impact, how that converges or diverges with the future of work and implications there. These are also part of what interdisciplinary educational programs need to be focusing on. Now, how do you do that? Well, at CMU, it's kind of baked into our DNA. Somehow we are just an institution where we do interdisciplinary work all the time. Happens to be a both and, layering on top of the traditional departments. Some departments are looking at, universities are looking at changing their structures. But I think what we found at CMU is that when you are focused on the problem, solving the problem, the interdisciplinary collaborations and communities are very natural. And those boundaries, again, going to Paul's comment about boundaries, the boundaries between disciplines are much more easily broken down. In my vision of the future, I've done a bit of interdisciplinary work myself. And what I recognize as so important is it requires building a new community. You're bringing together different ones with different languages, cultures, conventions, norms. And what does that require? Building community around and creating new language, new cultures, new norms. And so I think we need to think about how we can do that in a way that leverages technology and different perspectives. So since we're talking about coming out of the pandemic and lessons learned from the pandemic, I think one of the things we can recognize is that multiple diverse perspectives that may be folks from different disciplines, different perspectives and epistemologies, different backgrounds, different life experiences can really enrich our approach and our capability of bringing innovation and creativity to addressing these wicked problems that I talked about. And with technology, the folks who are learning together, who are researching together, they can be located anywhere, anytime in doing that collaborative work. I'll also go back to another possible link to Nancy's comments. I think with interdisciplinary work of universities in the future, we want to be looking for partnerships. One institution need not do this alone because its specializations and its, best, qualities and scholars will only represent a part of the puzzle. And so looking to collaborate across institutions could be virtually, could be with co-location or other kinds of consortia or other relationships can really make this new way of thinking about the role of the university to help solve the world's problems more sustainable, because it's no one that needs to solve that problem or do that work alone. So I'll leave it at that and just say that I really appreciate the opportunity to be in this panel and contribute a few thoughts along with these esteemed colleagues.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lovett. The key word here I pull away is relevance, because I see this with students. They demand relevance now. They want to be relevant to the world, and they want the curriculum to be relevant to the ethics that they have and the values that they have. And I also love your humanities plug, because my bumper sticker would be STEM is not enough. We have got to understand the thing we have that computers don't have, which is a humanities background and a human understanding and our values. So now we've looked with the magnifying glass, but there's an elephant in the room, and the elephant is cost. And it's very important to actually talk about it. So Chancellor Salgado, my question for you gets to cost. The university's value proposition is constantly an issue because its costs are going up and have gone up for decades, faster than inflation and faster than cost of living, giving the financial pressures that everybody faces inequitably. So how do you think models are going to evolve in the coming decade to forge a sustainable path so that we can exist given these rising costs?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm wonderful to be here with all of you, especially as a leader in a community college space where we think about cost every day. Our annual tuition for a full-time student is $3,500. $3,500, okay? And we have not raised tuition in 8 years. Why? Because every dollar for our students matters. They're trying to get through life while they're getting through their higher education. And life has thrown so many things in their way. And yet they're with us. They're paying the tuition. They're showing up. They're persevering. So I want to stress that we have an incredible responsibility to look at costs from a student perspective, not from an institutional perspective, right? And that means examining, how we do our work on a regular basis, but it's examining the value proposition as well, okay? And so let me just say to what Nancy talked about when you were explaining, the future of us as anchor institutions, that's what community colleges are. We are that today. We provide that value proposition on a daily basis. We don't struggle with trust. We're part of the higher ed community. I might say, I have to say, for many years, quite shunned from the higher ed community, okay? Not fully embraced by the higher ed community. And yet the very thing that we have been working on in community colleges is the very thing that higher education as a whole needs more today than ever. That connection to community, that openness to work with any and all students, that flexibility and adaptability, and the relevance to who? The relevance to the local community, and the partnership. We have long recognized in community college that we just will not perform at our best without those partnerships. And so, to the question about cost, we need to make sure that we're looking at this as a system. What are we doing today to help in that regard, right? Because we do receive quite a bit of resources from local government, which allows us to keep our tuition low. And therefore, our value proposition should be deep into community, deep into public schools. We've taken our early college work, made it completely free, while it's dual credit, dual enrollment to Chicago public school students. We've taken our curriculum in relevant pathways and brought it into our public schools, and are increasingly doing that and making sure that our students, as was said earlier, are graduating with credentials, that are graduating with credits, that are graduating with associate's degrees. Now, that's our part. But universities must increasingly accept those credits. We have universities that turn away high-performing students with associate's degrees because they want them to take those classes at their college, right? So this, what I would call nonsense, has to stop because from a student perspective, right, we need to be looking at overall cost. We are driving down cost for students, whether they come to our institution or not, right? But that only gets fully realized in an environment that fully embraces us as an overall system. The other way we drive down cost, and I want to lift up a partnership that we're doing with University of Chicago, not a traditional transfer institution that we would necessarily work with, but one that is building out a data science program as we speak. And we too want to build out a data science program for our students. And so we've built a model where the postdoc students that are at the University of Chicago teaching the data science course at the University of Chicago this past fall came to City Colleges and are now teaching the data science program at City Colleges of Chicago. We are building a data science program at City Colleges of Chicago with the assistance and partnership of the University of Chicago. So partnerships like this, that allow us to extend beyond our comfort zone, to not be protective, to be open, to bring value to local populations. This is what we need to be doing more about. Now, I'll just end by saying this. We need to extend ourselves. Ask yourself as an institution, how far are we extending ourselves in order to meet the needs of the learner and the learner that we have and the learner that we should have, right? How far are we extending our ability to reach a learner that may not traditionally be in our institution? And if we're asking that question hard enough, we're going to have to make some tough financial decisions too. right? In order to keep costs down. I truly believe, coming a little bit from the outside in, there's been a little bit of unwillingness to make the tougher financial decisions that will lead to keeping costs down for students.
Wise words, and this reminds us of the absolutely critical role community colleges have to play if we're ever going to have a sustainable solution. And yet that we fail at the systems level to often think about system solutions in the ecosystem. We actually had an ecosystem question, and I'm just going to invite any panelist and all panelists to answer these questions as I pull them up. But we had a systems level question from somebody at, I think, a place called Kenzie Academy. And the question was fundamentally, how do small universities survive and exist in a world where mega universities, where large-scale universities have the economies of scale to survive and prosper in the world that we can imagine in a few years? So how do we create a reality in which the small university has a chance and a reality?
Happy to jump in, but Nancy, you look poised. Okay.
Go ahead, Paul.
So I do think there are models for this. One of the ones that I think has been very interesting is to look at platform cooperative movements. They're, people in the United States often think of co-ops as a group of hippies that runs a small grocery store down at the corner. But in reality, as you know, in many societies, cooperatives can support enormous industries. I think 70% of healthcare is administered by co-ops in places like Argentina. But platform cooperatives allow small, if you think about it in the context of, let's use the one that people will know, Ace Hardware. And it's a kind of a homely analogy, but Ace Hardware is like small, locally owned, independent hardware stores that can no longer compete with the Home Depots of the world. And when they become part of a cooperative, they've got a centralized platform for which they can get both collective buying power for everything from employee insurance to the goods that they buy from suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. They also get all kinds of discounts on things like their FedEx packaging, et cetera, transportation. They can also draw on one tech stack so that all of their inventory controls, et cetera, are drawn from one, which dramatically lowers the cost of their operating and usually increases their margins in some fashion. So I think there are models out there. We're experimenting with one now. It's been reported on most recently, where we've created a new support organization which would allow us to build a centralized platform for small, community-embedded, culturally aware institutions that are very important for the populations they serve. But the idea there is that everyone would have a common tech stack. Everyone's using the same back office, financial aid processing, et cetera. These are common in healthcare. So you might have a very large healthcare system, which creates a support organization. So it's not an acquisition, but a support organization that supports all the community-based healthcare providers in their region. So there are interesting models, whether the platform cooperative or if this thing pans out, but we do have to, the joy of those small institutions is they're often trusted in a way that large institutions are not. They're known, they're culturally sensitive, and the people who work there often look like the people who are being served. And we've had some of our best luck, and the third version of this would be partnerships, of course. And we've had some of the best luck with some of our most underserved learners when we go in as a very large university and then partner with someone on the ground that does know the community is very well trusted. We do this in refugee camps in Africa and Lebanon, and we do it in underserved communities in the US. There's hope.
This reminds me of the agricultural cooperatives I've seen around the world because smallholding farmers otherwise just cannot compete with Monsanto and the big companies.
Yep.
Nancy.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say, in some ways similar to what Paul said, but what I was going to emphasize again is if you're a set of anchor institutions in a community or a region and you collectively get together, then there's a chance for very easy positive plus factors, if you will, between institutions, large and small, and different kinds of institutions. We run, we're the backbone, for example, for the Newark City of Learning Collaborative, which is committed to raising the post-secondary attainment rate of residents of Newark. And it's got a whole bunch of institutions in it, community colleges, small liberal arts colleges, large universities like ours. And we work together to figure out the space that is appropriate for a given student at a given time. But it allows the whole city to come behind the whole set of institutions, and that becomes very important.
Thank you. We have a question about curriculum that I think is quite interesting. It's the question is that in 5 years, when you think about the curriculum, and I'm kind of curious about the community college perspective of this, Juan, and also about the four-year college perspective on curriculum, Marsha. But when you look 5 years out, do you think we're going to have more asynchronous offerings and less human contact, or do you think we're going to have as much human contact as we have now in curricular offerings?
I don't think that's in 5 years. It hasn't. I was just saying our example. You know, we went into the pandemic with 90% of our courses in person and 10% online. And today we have the three modalities: in person, online live, which is Zoom enabled, in person experience, if you will, and our traditional online offering. And increasingly, we have students that are choosing the online live. It's nearly 45% of our students, but we're still at 90% that are having some in person. And all of the services are in person, of course. And I think what's most important is that for students, relationships continue to be important. They're important in their life, they're important in their journey, they're important to their academic well-being. So, regardless of the modality, I think we will need to continue to focus in on the relationship process, the process of belonging to an institution, belonging to a community. And in terms of curriculum, I think the big shift, will be the continual work that we need to do to remain relevant with the needs of the marketplace as well, to make sure that we're working with industry leaders, as we are at City Colleges of Chicago, to backwards map our curriculum to what their needs are. And the good news is we're not that far away. Oftentimes good example is we sat down with Accenture a few years ago, who never hired a single student from a city college with an associate's degree. And when they took a close look at our curriculum, got to meet our students, what they discovered is a new pool of possibility for them. We're now the 5th largest source of entry-level hiring to the Accenture office in Chicago, right? Within a 5-year period that includes a pandemic. And so, maintaining relevance in our curriculum will continue to be of heightened importance.
Thank you. Marsha?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on this, and I'll lean into the humanistic side of things again by saying our educational mission is inherently a humanistic endeavor we're engaged in. So I don't see human contact or connection. I don't see that as being eliminated or even reduced much more. But I think what's important in my mind is thinking about, to increase flexibility, to increase opportunity, we want to use the synchronous time and think of that as precious time for interaction, for collaboration. It may be between an instructor and students, it may be peer-to-peer among students, and really thinking about using that thoughtfully while still offering lots of flexibility with asynchronous learning opportunities. The other thing that I think I want to emphasize in terms of asynchronous learning is that oftentimes that's equated with a passive consumption of content. But asynchronous does not necessarily mean that. In fact, thinking about how asynchronous learning can be very interactive, it can be very responsive, and it can actually be very engaging and aim to create more, contribute to that sense of belonging that Juan mentioned, that I think also would be a part and be a key part of the synchronous time or the interpersonal time with the online or in-person learning.
Well, I'm glad for one to hear that relationships aren't going anywhere, because I think it's critical to learning and to trust building. We had a question that actually lines up with your story about Accenture. So Chancellor Salgado, I want to make this connection and see what you all think. The question was that I was recently talking to a 45-year-old person of color who completed a bachelor's degree in business, and the college supported him in his education, but now he can't get a job. And what's the responsibility that a university has? You know, they've taken your time, which we've talked about how precious time is, and they've taken your money and given you some debt. What's the responsibility universities need to have going into the future for helping you actually find a career?
I'll jump in real quickly on this and then turn to others. One of the things we see in our student body is they don't have the social capital networks out there. So you can't just have a degree. You need, this world works by social capital networks. And so we teamed up with Braven, a nonprofit, to create career, and Juan probably knows about them from Chicago, to create a career accelerator, mentorship, employees from all the big corporations around here and some of the nonprofits and others come and mentor our students before they leave the institution. It translates into internships and then ultimately, sometimes a large amount of times, into jobs. And the statistics are incredible in terms of what it comes out. Very substantial increase over the national average for low-income students of color who come here, who are part of Braven in getting strong jobs 6 months out. So it's like what Juan described. We also have those specific relationships as he has with Accenture. But I think having it part of our curriculum is actually really important so that the social capital networks are actually created during the time in college, not afterwards. You're not scurrying around afterwards to see if you know somebody who can hire you.
Thank you. Paul, you want to jump in?
Absolutely ditto to everything Nancy just said. It's maybe the most important part. So if you think about getting internships and sorts of things that Nancy pointed to, probably most critical. There's a whole bunch of things where it should be more responsible for at the front end of the process, which includes giving students better insight into the performance of the programs into which they're enrolling, what those graduates are doing, what kinds of earnings, what are the other options, making sure that we are giving them good consumer data. And then this part that I wrestle with, because I want to be held responsible for the things I control and not for the things that are out of my control. So sometimes when I'm talking to policymakers, I'll say, great, like I'll do everything right on my end. Will you guarantee that the economy will be robust in Shreveport, Louisiana, and that my major, or that the data and the jobs you're telling me I need to prepare for today, which are going to take a while to gear up, are those jobs still going to be there in the abundance? And I was still thinking about, there was a great piece of in the New York Times about what was happening with the Pennsylvania system. And if you may remember this, they featured a young woman who was getting a journalism degree in a very small town in Pennsylvania. What do you do with that student? Because here's what I would have told in the beginning. There's probably no job unless you're willing to jump in your car and move. And even then, you're in a really tough field. So let's talk about that. But she was really rooted in her hometown. And you think about, what is the responsibility of an institution in its place to have those very hard conversations? And then the harder one, what are you doing with your journalism department? Should you have that program? Should you be marketing that program? Like, what's our ethical responsibility on the front end? So, God, it's a tough one. It's a complicated one. You know, we're because we're large and online, we have students all over the country. And now sometimes I get a student who very much like the student spoke with, is like, I was, I majored in criminal justice and I've always wanted to be in X, Y, Z. So I was like, tell me where you live. And even while I'm sort of going back and forth, I'll Google the town and like the population, and I'll look at the police force. Like, there are 2 police officers in your town. And like, should you move? Like, what is that conversation? And what was our responsibility for that? Right. So it's very much a work in progress.
Can I just put a big plug in though for journalism programs?
I was a journalist major. I love journalism.
No, because they are so critically important to telling the local story. And so what the answer is not, and I know you weren't saying this, Paul, it's not getting rid of journalism programs. It's tailoring them to be the kinds of pathways for these kinds of students in local communities to actually be making a difference in changing the narrative about communities.
Yeah, it's
Well,
true,
and-
but it pains me because if you think about it, depending who that student is, we know the data
Right.
come out of strata, right? If you're underemployed 1 year out, you're 50% of those students will be underemployed 5 years
Right.
out, and 50% of them will, or 70% of them will be 10 years out. It's like,
But there's our responsibility is to think expansively. It goes back to what Marsha was saying, think expansively about the lived curriculum that we're teaching in there and how to connect
Well,
it to
and-
problem solving in communities.
And what Juan said, we have to stretch, right? How are we going to stretch? How are we going to serve those students? Because what we know is we live in a world of disinformation. We need journalists to make sense of the craziness of our world. But how do we stretch to be able to create the demand we need for the supply we have to create? So it's hard. And this goes back to something, actually, Michael Druckmann, who introduced me, put a question up that I want to get to too, which is fundamental to this, which is, if you as universities, as community colleges are going to be able to serve people, we need to stretch out not only to career building after the fact, but also back to high school, middle school, and much earlier than that even. And we can see that, and yet we're so bad at breaking through those silos. And his question is, how do we imagine partnerships breaking through these silos so that we have pathways of learning that can actually hold somebody's hands? And this goes right to another question I got, which is how do we get graduation rates to be improved for persons from marginalized backgrounds? Which again, if you don't do the whole pathway, you're not solving the fact that they're facing constant barriers at every step of the education that make it difficult for them to be able to succeed the way we want them to succeed. So, this is the expansive question, right? How do we possibly become better at breaking through these barriers and silos than we have been so far?
Look, Illah, I believe that our students can get master's degrees in 6 years from entrance into high school. Okay. If we think about, right, hey, how do we redesign things, right? Where you could get an associate's degree by the time you graduate from high school, leveraging community colleges. Let's leverage community colleges to our fullest as publicly supported institutions. Let's make sure, as we're doing in Chicago with something we call the Chicago Roadmap, our historic partnership with our K-12 school district, that we've made the most value proposition possible, every asset that we have to our public school students, prioritizing those students that are in the lowest income communities in our city, right? In those schools. And then let's partner with four-year universities. I think the four-year universities, over time, it would be better for them to be focused on the last 2 years of a bachelor's degree and the first year of a master's degree, or condense that master's degree in a way that that allows us to dream about, having many more students of color, many more low-income students, not just with bachelor's degrees, but with actually master's degrees. Degrees matter. If you look at the data, wherever you get your degree in, this conversation about degrees not mattering is a bad conversation for low-income communities, for people of color. Everybody on this call has a degree. We have to have advanced degrees. That's the issue, and we can keep the debt low if we're actually working directly with the high schools, leveraging our community colleges.
That 6-year plan makes me think of European models where you get people to the point where they have practical craft, trade, and capability much, much faster because you start earlier on that path. I know you had your hand up, Paul.
only that I so agree with Juan. And then you take a look at the fact that on average, students graduating with a 2-year degree lose 43% of their credits nationally when transferring into a 4-year. We have a deeply, deeply broken transfer credit system that perpetuates the inequities, right? Think about who goes to community colleges. So who has to go longer, pay more, take more time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We got to fix that system.
So you all are coming up with a roadmap here. I hope Michael and company are taking notes, because this is actually a nice revolutionary way to think about education, which I really appreciate. We have a question that's different, but I think really interesting, which is about mastery transcripts, the idea of getting away from grades. And what you all think of that, whether you think that puts students at an advantage or disadvantage going forward. Any takers?
I'll jump in on that one. We've been talking about the future of work implicitly throughout this conversation and making the learning relevant. So I think one of the things that we can really lean into is how a mastery-based or competency-based transcript could really make transparent to the student, to the future employer, and within the higher ed community, what it is we're doing and what those outcomes are, making them clearly articulated and sort of demonstrably assessed, so that the transcript carries meaning and actually ideally is aligned with some of those competencies that we're seeing in the employment areas that we know are growth areas. So this could be a really powerful tool, and it could actually help shape not only the way we provide credentials, but it could actually shape curricula as well to be relevant. This is going back to the relevance point.
You know,
I
the
think
great,
it also
Go
could
ahead.
really, oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead. Nancy.
I think it could also really expand the population of students that we attract back to school. One of the huge things is how to get people to re-enroll, get people who have some credits but no degree, who got disrupted by the pandemic, but it happened before the pandemic. And really, one way to do it is to really think about the competencies that are there. And alongside the competency notion is the notion of getting away from remedial work. We have got to get away from, we're not going to smooth those pathways, for example, from community college to four-year institutions, from high school to community college to four-year institutions, unless we get away from this remedial notion.
Right.
And really think about what are the competencies and how do we accelerate the learning of those competencies rather than try to select out for a certain kind of mastery, if you will, a certain grade, a certain remedial approach.
Now, I did a book in 21, the first year of the pandemic, that's called Students First, which argues for moving away from our time-based system to a competency-based system, because it does allow you to just address all kinds of problems and equities in the system. But one thing I just touched upon very briefly in that book, if you do it with rigor, and it does require rigorous assessment, because performance-based assessments are really, like, that's hard. It will also surface for a while just how poor our practices are across our
Yes.
K-16 system. So it would be painful for a lot of us, for the system to go through that change, but I think it's required.
I love it. And it's interesting. During COVID, I saw kind of a flexibility, a willingness to change in a number of universities and colleges that I work with. Unfortunately, I've seen some people kind of gradually snapping back now to where they were before COVID. And I hope that we can stop that. We have to step that out, because that flexibility is really powerful. Well, I want to thank the group of wonderful guests that we have. I think this has been a lovely conversation, and you all online have asked excellent questions and really brought the important issues to the forefront.